Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of Boca Goes Live. My name is John Thomason, managing editor of Boca magazine. And with me today is film historian Scott Eyman. Scott is the author of 14 books, including the 2014 New York Times bestseller, John Wayne, The Life and Legend, and two other New York Times bestsellers with veteran actor Robert Wagner, You Must Remember This and Pieces of My Heart. His third collaboration with Wagner, I Loved Her in the Movies, was published in November 2016. His brand new 15th book, which we'll be talking about today, is Cary Grant, A Brilliant Disguise. And here it is. Scott has won multiple writing awards for his biographies, feature writing, film, and literary criticism. He is an adjunct professor of film history at the University of Miami and is a frequent guest for Turner Classic Movies programming, both at film festivals and on screen. And he lives right here in West Palm Beach. Thanks so much for being with us today, Scott.
Happy to be here, John. How are you?
I'm well. And before we dive into your latest work, I'd like to start with a couple of questions about the state of movies today. I've never really seen anything in my lifetime quite like this, where the second largest movie theater chain, Regal, has closed all of its cinemas. The studios are releasing none of their prestigious or even their money-making titles. And the few theaters that are surviving are doing so mostly with empty auditoriums. And I have to wonder if this industry is going to survive COVID. So my question to you as a historian, has Hollywood survived any time like this in the past?
Well, the only comparable experience would be the 1918 flu epidemic, which killed more people, at least comparatively, at comparative place in the pandemic. And the studios closed down in LA. And some theaters closed down, but nothing like what we've witnessed in the last 10 months, nothing. It's been, we're through the looking glass, basically. Nothing like this has actually happened before. So any theories about what might eventually be the outcome are pure speculation. I thought if theaters were going to disappear, it would take a good 10, 20 years of a gradual evolutionary process, de-evolutionary process. But I think the pandemic could possibly act as an accelerant to speed the de-evolution up considerably. The question is, if 3 or 4 major circuits go bust, who picks them up, if anybody? And the only movie studio I could imagine that would do it would be Disney. Disney might pick up a theater circuit. They have the money, they have the wherewithal. They tend to be very forward thinking about making chess moves, and it might make sense. Nobody else, I can't think of any other studio that would be interested in picking up a theater chain because A, they wouldn't have money, and B, they wouldn't want to make such a speculative bet. So I personally don't think anybody's going to be going back to the theater in any numbers until there's a vaccine.
And how would you feel if, like you say, this accelerates theaters to the point of extinction? Theaters have been the primary mode of watching movies for over a century now. How would you feel if all movies went to basically a streaming platform?
Size matters. Size matters. The quality of the sound matters. All these things matter. You remember 30 or 40 years ago when they had these little bandbox multiplexes with lousy projection and thin walls that you could hear the sound from one movie bleeding into the other auditorium, and how disconcerting that was and what a cheap jack experience it was. In the last 15 years or so, they've really gotten rid of a lot of that, and the experience is ultimate or close to ultimate. Now, of course, there's the alternative point of view that really how many movies justify that kind of upscale treatment, And Warner Brothers tried it with the Christopher Nolan movie Tenet, and was stunned at the lack of audience in America. So nobody wants to stub their foot on that again, because that's a $200 million picture. And that's a lot of red ink, Warner Brothers can take it. They're a multinational, like Disney's a multinational. But that's why everybody's pushing their big releases like the James Bond film into, way into next year and eating the carrying costs, which on a $200 million film are considerable. That means you're eating $25 to $40 million in interest costs to carry that thing forward for a year, which nobody wants to do, but they'd rather do that. And of course, there's been talk about maybe just selling some of these big pictures directly to Amazon or Netflix. But that's a slippery slope, because once you start doing that, you'll never get people back into the theaters, because they're not going to rush back to see Liam Neeson's latest back-breaking action picture. That's what you do. Those films are kind of, I think, generally moving towards streaming availability. But so your guess is as good as mine, basically. But I'm not pessimistic, but I'm not optimistic either. At this point, it's a question of how long it takes for us to feel that we can safely go out and mingle with each other.
And what do you think of the resurgence of drive-in movies? This is like a relic of the 1970s that I never thought would come back again.
I think it's great. Especially if you can hide one or two people in the trunk and smuggle them in and not pay for them. That's, as we used to do, among other things you used to do at drive-ins. I see no downside to that at all. The sound's not very good, but that's a small thing that's a small price to pay for going out and actually breathing fresh air and seeing a movie.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about your new movie, or your new book, Cary Grant, A Brilliant Disguise. I like the Springsteen reference in the title. Now, one of those disguises of Cary Grant, of course, is his name. He was born Archie Leach and took on the name Cary Grant. What else about him was a disguise, and a brilliant one at that?
Well, the accent, for one. I mean, he was born in Bristol, and the Bristol accent is a working class accent. If he maintained the Bristol accent, he was going to be playing farm foreman all of his life in England, because accent is a play just to segment you in terms of the English acting. That's why all the English actors wanted to sound like Ronald Colman or Leslie Howard. So he had to get rid of that accent, and what he came up with was a touch of Cockney, because he joined this acrobatic troupe called the Bob Pender Troupe when he was 14 years old, and a lot of the kids were Cockneys from the East End of London. So he magpied a little bit of the Cockney accent, and the rest of it he just sort of came up with as an approximation somewhere in the vicinity of Noel Coward, added with an added touch of Cockney to give it a little working class thing. But as a friend of mine who was brought up in Bristol, he said most Englishmen don't consider Cary Grant's accent English at all. To the American ear, it sounds vaguely English, but to the English, it doesn't sound English at all. That's why it's called Mid-Atlantic, basically, because it's totally original.
Right. That's interesting. And now, what would be like an example of something that you learned about Grant through the research of this book that maybe surprised you?
To the extent to which he was a lone wolf all of his life. There's a diary he kept for 5 or 6 months when he was 14 years old. And basically, it just involves him cutting school and going to the music hall and to the theater and occasionally to movies. There's nothing about anything going on in the outside world. There's nothing about World War I, for instance. It's 1918 when he was 14. And nothing about family to speak of. His mother was already institutionalized. There's 1 or 2 glancing references to his father, but nothing of any content. It's a roster of comings and goings, and as he put it in the diary, roaming. That was his word, roaming. So he was on his own, and the extent to which he was on his own at such an early age was very surprising to me. He was very self-contained, even as a kid, and it's not surprising once you read the diary that was the same year he got kicked out of school, because I'm sure he wanted to get kicked out of school, and he began an apprenticeship with the acrobatic troupe I mentioned earlier. So it was he was the master of his own ship. He was the captain of his fate.
And did that lone wolf status drive him as an actor, as an artist, the fact that he didn't have these maybe these entanglements of some other actors?
Yes, to a great extent. He was one of the few movie stars who went independent very early, 1937, 38. He had a commitment a picture a year at Columbia, picture a year at RKO. And other than that, he was on his own. You know, he had been at Paramount from the end of 1931, but he left Paramount because he didn't think he was getting the kind of attention that he needed if he was going to make breakthrough and be a star. Because at Paramount, they serviced Gary Cooper and Marlene Dietrich, and everybody else had to make do with what was left over. And he was very conscious of the fact that he wasn't really making that much progress. So he took a gamble and went out on his own and signed these kind of holding deals at RKO and Columbia, which turned out to be very successful. I mean, at RKO, he made Gunga Din, and at Columbia, he made The Awful Truth and His Girl Friday and a whole roster of fine pictures. But he took, it was a risk. There weren't many independent contractors amongst movie stars in that era because most actors are broke for a long time before they make it. So once they make it, they were eager to sign up for that 7-year contract because there was a great deal of money, not a great deal of freedom, but they had freedom and it was very difficult. So very few actors wanted to go freelance. Grant went freelance and it worked out very well for him because his salary rose very quickly and he got percentages of the profits during World War II when not too many big actors got percentages. They were getting straight salary.
Now, this book is exhaustively researched, and it's written in a really lively and an analytical way. And I wonder if you felt at times like you were putting Cary Grant on the couch, so to speak, and is drawing conclusions about somebody's psychology part of the job of the biographer?
Well, you're trying to make connections. You're trying to make connections, and you've got the advantage of hindsight, which your subject didn't have at the time, because they're just trying to survive day to day. So yeah, there is an element of psychology. I try not to belabor it. I try in the same way. I try not to be a prosecuting attorney. I'm not somebody that's nailing anybody to the cross. It becomes a question of what did they know and when did they know it. Yeah. And you know, most people for a long time in their lives are kind of groping in the dark. It can be very difficult, especially if you're Archie Leach pretending to be Cary Grant.
Now, did you do a lot of home viewing homework of Grant's films, or have you seen them enough times that they're pretty well locked in your memory?
Well, I wanted to see them all again, or the vast majority of them again, in the different contexts, because it's one thing to be watching a movie for pure enjoyment. It's another thing to be watching a movie analytically in terms of researching someone's professional choices. So yeah, I watched almost everything again. Even North by Northwest, a film I've seen probably 15 or 20 times. Right. You know, but I felt I should see it in the context of the films he was making around it, to see the evolution of his style as he approached fairly late middle age.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about Hitchcock. Now, my favorite Cary Grant roles are probably, like most people, the masterful comedies, whether it's Arsenic and Old Lace or the great screwball film Howard Hawks. My favorite drama is probably Only Angels Have Wings, a really underrated picture.
Yeah.
But Hitchcock, I feel, maybe pushed Grant more than any director I can think of. Thinking of films like Suspicion, where he was cast as a charming psycho killer. Did Hitchcock see in Grant's persona and his patrician appearance something a little more subversive than other directors?
Well, they were both working class Englishmen who invented personas for themselves, you know, and both became enormously wealthy because of that self-invention. So I think Hitchcock recognized elements of himself in Grant, and Grant recognized elements of himself in Hitchcock. Now, Hitchcock had a different person. Hitchcock kept a very light tone, usually on a film set, unless you're Tippi Hedren. Right. Grant worked very hard on a film set. The magic happened when the light came on, you know. Until then, he tended to worry and fret, and maybe the dialogue could be better. And are you sure this is the way we should do it? He wasn't always 100% certain of the project, of the scene, but once the light went on, Cary Grant went on, and that radiant personality filled the screen. So I think they recognized elements of each other. and worked to both their advantage. What Peter Bogdanovich has a wonderful line. He said Hitchcock brought out Grant's bass notes. And that's exactly what he did. Partially in Suspicion until they had to reshoot the ending of the picture because of the censor problems, but especially in Notorious, my favorite, probably my favorite Hitchcock of all, where he's just a block of rage, suppressed rage. And the contrast between his use of his body in a comedy where he's very limber and loose, jointed, in a movie like Arsenic and Old Lace or His Girl Friday. But in Notorious, he's completely contained. There's no movement really from the shoulders at all. And his whole body turns. So much of Grant's power as an actor resided in his confidence in his body, which came from his acrobatic training. So he physicalized the character to a remarkable extent, which is something very few actors are capable of doing because they tend to be dead from the neck down because they don't have the confidence in their bodies. They don't think of themselves as physical beings. They think of themselves as psychological beings. But Grant thought of himself as a physical being in terms of his act.
Right. And you said he was more comfortable in the loose-limbed comedic roles than in the bass notes of Hitchcock?
Well, he knew he could do it. He knew he could do it because it was close to his acrobatic background. So it was something he was comfortable doing. He thought his worst performance was Arsenic and Old Lace because it was over the top. He thought Capra forced him into hysteria, and he wasn't really comfortable going quite that far. I happen to love it until maybe the last half hour when it is a little exhausting. But that's the script too. It's a farce, and I don't personally think it's possible to overplay farce.
Right.
Grant did think it was possible to overplay farce and that he was guilty of it with Capra's urging. I'm not sure at all. I think Capra might have been right on that case. But it was he trusted Hitchcock. So he was willing to go places with Hitchcock that he might not have been willing to go with the exact same script being directed by someone else.
Now, you've also written a biography about John Wayne, and if I had to pick an actor who was more opposite from Cary Grant in every way, it would probably be John Wayne. Mm-hmm. However, if these two guys, ever met and talked shop, and I don't know if they did, but would they have had things in common?
They had quite a bit in common. Grant didn't particularly like John Wayne. He didn't think he was a very good actor. There's an interesting letter. One of Grant's best friends was Irene Mayer Selznick, who after she divorced David Selznick, she moved to New York and became a theater producer and produced A Streetcar Named Desire, among other plays. And Grant was an investor in her shows for $5,000 or $10,000 per show. He did not take a lot of wild flights. He was a very conservative investor. But because Irene was a friend, he would offer these small investments, and he made him a lot of money on A Streetcar Named Desire. But occasionally he would offer casting suggestions, and one of them involved a joking reference to John Wayne, who he didn't regard as, from the reference, he didn't regard as a terribly expert actor. Actually, they had a lot in common. In that when you think of Cary Grant, you think of that radiance, you think of that smile, you think of his response to actresses like Katharine Hepburn or Irene Dunn. And Wayne also projected an image. Wayne projected an image of strength above all, whereas Grant projected a completely different image, a suave image, someone who doesn't get terribly ruffled even when there's a crop dusting plane chasing him across Kansas. He looks concerned, but not panicked.
Right.
Right. So that's an interesting gradation there. But each of them understood the importance of projecting specific guidelines for the audience to latch onto that moved from film to film to film, irrespective of the script, irrespective of the director.
I also wonder if neither of them were particularly beloved by critics and by Academy voters. I think with John Wayne, it wasn't until The Shootist that he received. Did he receive an award for that or a nomination?
He got his Oscar for True Grit.
Oh, for True Grit, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And did Cary Grant ever win anything?
Grant never got a competitive Oscar. He got an honorary Oscar. He was nominated for None But the Lonely Heart and for Penny Serenade. He got nominated twice, but he didn't win. But he got an honorary award in 1970.
Did he feel that he was being overlooked by the Academy? Did that puncture his ego?
The only comment he ever made about it was sitting in the audience when Harold Russell got his Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for Best Years of Our Lives. And Grant made an ungracious remark to the extent if he'd known that was all it took, he would have blown his hands off too.
Wow, what a line! Wow, that was an amazing performance. What a line!
He was good, and Harold Russell's really good in Best Years of Our Life. But yeah, I don't think it ruined his life. But I think he thought he gave a couple of good performances that could have gotten the attention. And after a certain point, after None But the Lonely Heart in 1944, he didn't really go out of his, in Notorious in 46, he kind of made it a point not to play anybody who was destroyed by life or beaten by life. Whereas in None But the Lonely Heart, that's the whole crux of the performance. The character is beaten by life and stays that way. And except for the very ending of Notorious, he's pretty well flummoxed as well. But after that, he pulled back from that kind of daring, that kind of risk. And
in fact, he retired pretty early from Hollywood.
He was 62 when he retired.
He probably could have worked for quite a ways.
Oh, sure. And he got offers. He got offers for years. For a good 10, 15 years, he still got offers. And he turned them all down. And he could have worked. He still looked good. But I think actually it was probably the correct decision. His last two pictures, Father Goose, which I rather like, and Walk, Don't Run, which I think is terrible. The problem is he was locked into a genre, romantic comedy, and he was too old to play the guy that gets the girl. And he was very conscious of that fact. He was very awkward getting him to play charade opposite Audrey Hepburn, who was 30 years younger than he was. And he did it, but he felt he was pushing it, you know. And when your hair starts to get white, it becomes a problem. And also the genre, the people who were really good at the genre, Leo McCarey and Howard Hawks, were dead or dying or retiring. And it's a hard genre. You can't fake that. You can't fake the magic of a great romantic comedy. And I think he thought that he'd done the best work he could with the best people he could, and that trying to keep the ball rolling was going to result in second and third string product. And I think he was proud of what he'd done. I think he understood that his batting average was really quite high for a movie star. It wasn't just a question of 4 or 5 wonderful movies in a 35-year career. He made close to 20 wonderful movies in a 35-year career. That's a lot. That's a lot. Most actors don't have anywhere near that roster of memorial pictures, stuff that you can drag out and say, this is who he was. This is who she was. Check it out. You know?
Yeah. Well, what you're saying about Grant's age, like vis-a-vis Audrey Hepburn and Charade, I think of Love in the Afternoon and Gary Cooper. Yeah. I mean, I found that cringeworthy when I saw it several years ago.
Well, it was supposed to be Cary Grant. They offered, Billy Wilder could never get Cary Grant to make a movie with him. He offered him 1, 2, 3. When he was going to be the encore of His Girl Friday thing of, you know, just talking a mile a minute, he offered him Love in the Afternoon. He offered him Sabrina. Grant always turned down Billy Wilder. It drove Billy Wilder nuts.
Wow.
Because he didn't understand it. So when Grant turned down Love in the Afternoon, he got Gary Cooper. And Grant was actually, Gary Cooper's only 2 or 3 years older than Grant, but Gary Cooper looks like he's about to drop, you know, keel over. Whereas nobody would have said anything if Cary Grant in the age of 53 and Audrey Hepburn at whatever she was, 26, 28, were making Love in the Afternoon. Nobody would have said anything. But Cooper aged rapidly after World War II, whereas Grant seemed to be middle-aged for 15 or 20 years.
Yeah. Now, you make a point in the book that his sexuality is often what people discuss about Cary Grant nowadays. I think that sort of gossip is really like an unimportant aspect to him. What do you think Grant's legacy is and should be?
As an actor?
I guess so, as an actor.
He's an aspirational figure. He was an aspirational figure for men, an aspirational figure for women. Men could only hope to be what Cary Grant played on the screen, and women could only hope to nab a man like Cary Grant played on the screen. What people don't understand was that Cary Grant was also an aspirational figure for Archie Leach. That was who he wanted to be in the best sense.
Right.
And it took him a long, long time to get to be that person. At the end of his life, he was pretty much, Archie Leach had finally managed to meld with Cary Grant. But I think what actually closed the deal was quitting show business. I think that it was when he could relax and stop worrying about being discovered to be an imposter, if you will. Right. I think that was always a fear that he had in the back of his mind, that someday, you know, the clock would strike 12 and the coach would turn into a pumpkin and he'd lose his Rolls Royce and everybody would, you know, start making jokes about Archie's accent, you know. But as it turned out, he relaxed once he retired and became a much warmer, more secure person. And he always said LSD helped a great deal too. So he had pharmaceutical assistance.
Yeah, that is, I did not know that about Grant, and that was fascinating to discover in the book too.
Yeah.
Everybody should go get it. It's published by Simon & Schuster, Cary Grant, A Brilliant Disguise. Before I let you go, Scott, we've got Halloween coming up this weekend. Do you like to watch classic horror films around this time to get you in the mood? And if so, do you want to name one or two?
Well, there's the Gothics, the old Universal Gothics, Frankenstein, Dracula. I like The Black Cat, a film with Karloff and Lugosi that's really kind of sick and twisted. For modern horror, I turn over and over again to The Shining. Yeah, that's my favorite modern horror film. Modern, it's 40 years old, but the reality is it has a lot of the classic horror tropes in broad daylight. I think that was Kubrick's way of raising the bar for himself, to not have any, you know, hands, you know, shooting out of the dark. He kept the lights on at all times. Right. Still scary, and it was still scary. That's tough to do.
So true. You mentioned The Black Cat. Was that Jacques Tourneur's movie?
No, that's Edgar Ulmer's movie.
Oh, so Jacques Tourneur.
Jacques Tourneur made The Cat People and Curse the Cat People.
Okay, yeah, he's probably my favorite of the. I mean, of course, he made westerns too, but his horror.
He made some wonderful noirs too, out of the past.
Yeah.
Tourneur was an all-rounder. Strange career. I keep waiting for him to like burst onto the A list, and he never quite did. They were always like mid-range between D's and A's. And then the 50s roll around and his career starts slightly going downhill. And he makes one last great horror picture with Curse of the Demon with Dana Andrews. But that's a fairly low budget picture. That's not a big movie by any stretch of the imagination. And then he's at AIP playing out the string. You know? And the pictures weren't very good at that point.
If I want to really freak myself out around Halloween, I tend to go with Rosemary's Baby.
Oh, that'll do it. That'll do it.
I say it was so terrifying because of the naturalistic approach of Polanski, where he made the paranormal seem so plausible and matter of fact. And the first time I saw it, I was alone in my parents' house. It was like 9 p.m, and I kept looking over my shoulder, reacting to every bump in the night that was happening around me, and it took me hours to fall asleep. Very effective.
Oh yeah, and the sudden shot of the baby's eyes. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, it's kind of scary. It is scary, but Polanski has a kind of genius for subliminal horror. It's always very subtle, and a lot of it has to do with the soundtrack. He does a lot of things with weird, slightly unreal ambient sounds that create a slight aura of something going wrong. Now, if you want a classic horror film, haunted house movie, that wonderful Robert Wise picture, The Haunting, is a wonderful picture. That's a classic. I think that's really underrated. And it's strictly a haunted house movie. It's the flip side, though, of a movie like The Shining, which is psychological horror that turns into physical horror. The Haunting is a classic ghost story, Shirley Jackson ghost story.
If you'd like a good one from this year, there's a film called Alone that's available in streaming right now.
Yeah.
And it's a woman survivalist picture against a psycho killer, kind of a classic 70s kind of grindhouse kind of a theme going on.
Who's in it?
No one I've ever heard of.
Okay.
It's low budget. It's independent. It reminded me of Duel, especially the very beginning. And
that's good.
We'll think of Duel too. I highly recommend this one, Alone.
That's good.
So what's next for you? Is there already another book planned?
Yeah, I take 6 months off after I finish a book, and then I start thinking about the next one. And by the time the book comes out, the last book comes out, I'm usually tracked on the next one, and I am now. But I don't like to talk about it. There are writers who talk endlessly about what they're working on, which is fine. But I find when I do that, I lose compression.
Mm-hmm.
I need to keep it bottled up inside me in order to get up to critical mass and start research and start writing. So I don't really talk about what I'm doing until I'm finished with it almost.
Well, you don't want to jinx it either.
No, I don't want to jinx it. I don't want to jinx it. And I don't want to give anybody else a good idea to write a book and beat me to it.
If viewers want more from Scott Eyman, you're going to be speaking November 9th. Do you want to tell a little bit about that appearance before we
November 9th is at the Cultural Council?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the appearance we're doing at the Cultural Council. We're shooting it there. No audience, social distancing at all times. I've been social distancing for 40 odd years though, but nobody, I didn't make a fetish out of it. Yeah, we'll be doing a thing for the Cultural Council, and my wife, Lynn Calber, will be interviewing me, and she's refusing to show me any of the questions. So I'm frankly a little alarmed at this point.
Like the presidential debates. Yeah, you have to be prepared for everything.
Yeah, well, Lord only knows what she's going to throw at me.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, John. Happy to do it.
All right. Have a good rest of your week.
Take care now.
And thank you all for tuning in to Boca Goes Live. This is John Thomason, managing editor with Boca Magazine. Have a great rest of your week and a happy Halloween.